Welcome to the video presentation entitled Studying Language, What is Linguistics? In this presentation, I'd basically like to whet your appetite about linguistics. Knowing that some of you think, well, maybe this isn't the most thrilling topic in the world, and maybe some of you are a little bit fearful of it. So when you think about the word linguistics, what images come to mind? Maybe something like this tree diagram. Well, analytically analysing the parts of sentences is something that linguistics has done. But it's only a part of a much broader approach to the study of language. And in this presentation, I'd like to reveal a little bit of the richness of linguistics. This richness isn't just to do with its scope, it's also to do with its approach. There is more than one way of approaching the study of language. There's more than one way of doing linguistics. And I'd like to outline two major traditions or approaches. So let's start with something basic. Linguistics is the study of language. The study of language. In the play Hamlet, the old man, Polonius, asks Hamlet what he thinks is a very simple question. Hamlet is reading a book, so Polonius asks, "What is it that you read, my lord?" And Hamlet replies, "Words, words, words," which is a very annoying response because that's not what Polonius wanted to know, of course. He wanted to know something like, what's the subject or the title of the book you're reading? Now, of course, reading involves reading words, but the achievement of reading isn't to be aware of words as words per se. That isn't the point of reading. Words merely mediate reading. Well, I bring this up really to point out that it is the mediating ways of language that is particularly the focus of linguistics. Linguists are interested in words, as words. Linguists are interested in such things as what a word is and what a word isn't. They worry about such things because they're interested in understanding the mediating system of language. And of course, in this, it isn't just words that concern them, but all the aspects of language that make up its system. How does language do what language does? How does language language? Language is fundamental to human life, to Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens use language. But is that significant? Couldn't we say that language is just part of being a biological entity? I mean, don't all animals communicate and socialize in some way? Their system of communication may be different to humans in some ways, but they certainly seem to communicate. We know that dolphins are very intelligent and make extraordinary noises that some biologists are trying to make sense of. Maybe one day, in the satirical novel The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it turns out that the dolphins were actually more intelligent than humans and were really studying and playing with us before they left the planet in their own spaceships. But seriously, is human language distinctive? Is human language uniquely distinctive? Please pause the video and have a think about what might be uniquely different about human language as opposed to animal language, and then when you're done, move on. Well, one way to see this is to recognise that animals certainly communicate, but in what fashion? Bees dance, birds signal to each other with very elaborate routines. Actually, the acoustic detail of birdsong is very intricate and our human ears don't pick up very much of it. It's too quick and high-pitched. But is this language in the important ways humans do language? Well, you could say, yes, it's communication. But what can we say about it? It seems that animal language tends to be restricted repertoires produced as a more or less automatic response, and therefore reactive to particular states of affairs. In other words, unlike human language systems, animal communication systems don't seem to have quite the generative ability or quality of human language. Human language seems capable of imaginative and creative responses to the contingencies of the environment. Humans' use of language can be proactive and not just reactive. Human language can create new meanings. New meanings that don't seem to be just a response to the environment. Humans can use language to shape their reality and not be constrained so much by their immediate context. Language makes us flexible creatures of possibility. For example, thanks to language, we don't just see a furry animal and have a reaction to that. We can say that the furry animal is not a cow or a cat, but happens to be a dog, let's say. Furthermore, we could say it's not a small dog or a medium-sized dog, but a big one. Furthermore, it's not awake, but asleep. Furthermore, we can imagine it's dreaming, but what of? Maybe a bone or a walk. And notice we can say something like dreaming of a lovely bone. So human language is incredibly flexible, not just a reaction to the environment. And that begs the question for linguists. How does language achieve this flexibility? And this is a tricky question. Very tricky. How to tackle it is not settled. But here are two broad traditions or approaches to it. The first tradition sees language as a window to the mind. When we study language, we need to see it as a window to the mind, according to this view. But then the other approach wants to say that when we study language, we should really see it as a window to our sociality. Now, if we see it as a window on the mind, then studying language is to study the structure of human thinking or human cognition. By contrast, if we see it as a window on our sociality, then studying language is to study how humans make meaning and interact with one another. So you can see that there are two very different takes on how to approach it. But we're going to now unpack the cognitivist approach, the first one, and then we'll move on to the other approach later. Perhaps the most famous linguist to be associated with this approach is Noam Chomsky. He posed himself this question: and answers it like this. This is quite a claim. Chomsky is saying that humans are genetically endowed with language. Now, notice that this is different to saying that language is generically unique. Humans wear clothes and no other animals wear clothes, so you could say this is a generically unique feature of humans. And this is different to saying that we are genetically predisposed to wear clothes. Well, Chomsky is saying that unlike our wearing of clothes, we are genetically disposed to use language. Why does he say this? What's the evidence for saying this? Well, one significant body of evidence is the ease with which children learn language or languages. an important insight here is that learning a language is not simply a matter of imitation, but it's also a matter of regulation. That is, by being able to generate language by applying a set of rules. And you know, this feature is really mind-boggling, to think that a human being can say something that is absolutely unique, to say something that's never been said before and still be meaningful. Well, Chomsky was very taken with language's generative quality, and he hoped to be able to show the structure that enables that, the generative capability of language. So he hypothesizes that we are wired for language thanks to a language acquisition device. And what is this device? Well, whatever it is, it enables the grammatical structures of different language, so it is itself a kind of a deep grammar or a universal grammar. It's universal because it is the grammar of all grammars. It's the structure that underlies any and all possible human languages. It is the deepest structure underlying any and every possible grammar of a human language. And this grammatical structure is what Chomsky seeks to lay out, the logic behind language's generative capability. So Dr. Chomsky, I'd like to ask you a few questions to clarify all this. What is it to study language? Okay, but competency, what's that? How do you study competency? I think I get it. Okay, so you're saying that there is language competency and language performance, but the valid study of language is only with competency. But what is that? Oh, phew, wow. Okay, you mean linguistics is principally concerned with the universals, the big picture of the human mind. Wow. So you can see that Chomsky's approach is based on valuing the very formal and abstract aspect of language. And consequently, Chomsky's linguistics is not going to investigate what makes individual competence different, but what makes them alike. In sum, language is to be investigated not through the study then of actual language use in context, but rather through the consideration of invented sentences intuitively felt to be acceptable instances of the language. Dr. Chomsky, what were you before you became interested in linguistics? Ah, yes, that figures. Okay, so let's look at a different way of thinking about the study of language. If the Chomskyan approach provides us with a formal grammar, the mother of all possible grammars, if that can be achieved, this alternative approach is going to provide us with something else, namely a functional grammar. Why functional? Well, unlike Chomsky, this approach embraces the sheer variety of language use, what Chomsky called linguistic performance. And so rather than try and map the innate structures in the mind, this approach wants to map the structure of language in terms of the ways it gets used. It wants to define grammar in terms of language use, as originating with language use. But this sounds also very ambitious, maybe in a different way to the Chomskyan approach. How can we find the structure of a thing like language use when there is such immense variety? In fact, let's pause here and jot down all the factors behind language variety in a single language like English. So press pause and write down some ideas and then return. So what might be the factors behind language variety use? Perhaps the most obvious factor is region or geography. People speak differently in different regions. People in the south talk differently to people in the north. Even people living within the same city can talk differently. In the UK, there's enormous variety of the ways English is spoken, for example. Another factor is culture and class. And of course, this is related to regionality, in that we can think of people living in the same region, the Bronx, say, or the Mississippi Delta, and as belonging to a culture, and we can think of a class as a kind of culture. Another example of culture, particularly of interest to educators, is peer culture. Think of the influence teenagers have on the way teenagers use language. The next one is similar to these last two, but is importantly different. This is situation, by which we mean social situation. The social situation that we are in, and we're always in one, impacts the kind of language we use. For example, we speak differently to our boss at work than say if we met her for a drink at a pub. And of course, children speak like children, and this can be very endearing. Imagine a child saying something like, "I bought it" for "I brought it." Such childish ways of pronouncing may sound cute to our adult ears, but it's not so cute or endearing in a school environment, which invites the question for us as educators. How should educators deal with language variation in school? Obviously, this is a very big question for us. A non-native learner of English is going to use English in different ways again. The influence of their native language, its grammar and pronunciation, is undoubtedly going to make a difference. So there we have it. I'm sure there are more factors that we could think of, but these 5 seem to be the main ones. So okay, I'd like now to give you 3 important words for your glossary. Dialect is the first one, probably the most familiar of the 3. A dialect, that's to do with language variety in which the use of grammar and vocabulary identifies the regional or social background of the user. Register, the next one. This next word refers to variety of language as a result of social situation. And, you know, most of us are pretty familiar with the terms formal and informal register, perhaps. This is to do with the way humans tend to structure their language and privilege certain vocabulary according to the social situation they perceive themselves to be in. But there's another dimension to all of this. If we think of knowledge as practice, so knowing something like knowing math or knowing science as really an opportunity to practice math or practice science, knowing science or knowing math is really then engaging in the practice of science or math. And it turns out that register and it turns out that these ways of practicing have their own registers. There is a sort of a register of science, well, more than one register of science, or register of doing history or doing math. So learning to become practitioners in these academic fields is partly going to involve learning their appropriate registers. Anyway, more on all this later in the course. The last one, interlanguage. A very important concept, getting a lot more attention right now, I think. This refers to a language variety which is the result of a non-native speaker learning a second language. So what exactly is this? Well, an interlanguage is neither the L1, say the mother tongue of the learner, nor the language that is being learned, the L2, but a mixture of the two, a mixture of L1 and L2. And the temptation has been to view this mixture purely as a problem or a deficiency, an error to fix. But it's a bit more complicated than that. And some linguists interested in language development point out the creative endeavour of learning a language, any language, and see the interlanguage as a healthy sign of necessary experimentation. So we shouldn't view it as something to fix, but something that happens along the way. Alright, so let's sum all this up. What we've been considering are the factors behind language variety, such factors as the way we pronounce things differently within just one language, the variety of accents that there are, the way different social groups privilege certain grammatical structures and vocabulary over others, the variety of dialects that are out there, the way we change our language to suit the particular social situation or practice, human practice, whether that be an academic practice that we happen to be involved in, the variety of registers that we employ. And finally, all these factors are within a single world language. So of course there are many world languages, and many of these are used or being learned by people who already have a different mother tongue, and so a kind of cross-fertilization occurs, and so this too is a source of language variety. So this is M.A.K. Halliday, another very influential linguist whose work has probably made more inroads into the work of teaching than any other linguist, though he's not too well known in the United States, maybe as he ought to be. But anyway, he was originally a Brit, and he emigrated to Australia, and for a very long time, if still not today, teachers in Australia, or parts of Australia that I know of, have to have at least a year's worth of courses in systemic functional linguistics. Systemic Functional Linguistics, or SFL, and this is largely based on the approach that Halliday pioneered. So what kind of a linguist is he? Well, you can call Halliday, if you like, a sociolinguist. And what is that exactly? The big idea here is that language may be internalized in the mind as abstract knowledge, but for this to happen it must be experienced as social behaviour. And all behaviour is, in an important sense, social, even if we are on our own. Language is, from this view, a phenomena that is describable as a system of signs, but this system has developed to meet the elaborate and cultural and communal needs of human societies. That's the point that Halliday wants to bring out. So the grammar of a way of using language is related to a social need or function. Studying grammar is studying also the kind of social dynamic that it embodies. Doing linguistics is doing a certain form of sociology. In Halliday's terminology, language is a social semiotic, a system of signs which are socially motivated or informed. And this system has developed to express social meanings. The sociality of meaning is very important to Halliday, in a way that it wasn't to Chomsky. Halliday talks about the meaning potential of language. The grammar and vocabulary of a language allows us to make certain meanings. It's a kind of resource. And I want to unpack all this a little bit more. For Halliday, meaning has at least two dimensions. Language has an ideational function and an interpersonal function. In fact, Halliday also talks about a third function, the textual, but we'll just stick to these two more obvious ones for now. The intuition behind the ideational function of language, according to Halliday, is that the world may be relatively unpredictable, it's full of things and processes that we can do nothing about, but language can reduce some of the uncertainty by categorization or conceptual projection. The fluffy moving shape over there can be identified as a dog as opposed to a cat or a cow. So language has this functional coping aspect. The first person ego has to cope with the third person reality of things and processes, is his way of summing that up. This ideational function of language has an impact on the grammar of the language as a result of that. But at the same time, humans are social beings, so even if we are marooned on a desert island, we are still social beings, and we mustn't forget that. We mustn't lose our sense of sociality, for if we do, we could risk insanity, as the Tom Hanks movie Marooned reminds us. So another hugely important function of language then is to do with this. It is to enable the first-person ego to cope with others by establishing a basis for social relations. Language, its grammatical structures, embodies how we relate to each other, the power differentials, the allegiances, the scope of solidarity, and so on. We could say that the various uses of grammar that we have expressed within different registers, genres and dialects have evolved in ways that take care of different patterns of sociality. Okay. Dr. Halliday, what other academic fields are really important to you apart from linguistics? Okay, interesting. So how is linguistics done? This Hallidayan functional linguistic or social linguistic approach is still interested in describing language as a system. It is still in the business of figuring out the grammar of language, but not in the Chomskyan sense. We might think this is a way of doing linguistics that is closer to the reality of human experience compared to Chomsky, and it is. But we mustn't forget that it too abstracts and idealises the phenomena of language in its own way as part of describing language. It is still interested in language as a system. All linguistic approaches involve description, and to do any kind of systematic description without selecting typical forms would be impossible. There's invariably going to be some degree of idealising the language that is being studied. And so I want to close by saying that any linguistic approach, just like any social science, privileges certain aspects of the phenomena at the expense of others. It's rather like the old Gestalt psychology example of the duck rabbit. Linguistics can never constitute a view from nowhere. It is always going to impose some framework that allows us to see one thing but not another. It will always be a kind of framework that allows us to see something but not everything. Do you see a rabbit? Can you see a duck? The point is, you can't see both at the same time. To think of linguistics as a science, we may think we're putting on the white coat of neutrality. But shouldn't linguistics help us in determining what is best, not neutral? After all, as educators, we have a responsibility to bring out the best in and for people. Shouldn't we look to linguistics to help us with doing what is best? And what is the best for children? So there would seem to be some element of prescriptivism that is necessary for us. So I'd like to end this presentation by having us reflect on this issue between description and prescription. It's a big issue. My task is to describe and explain the phenomena of language. It is not to evaluate, the descriptivist might say. Yes, but I care about language so much that I feel we've got to look after those forms which are worthy of us to aspire to, replies the prescriptivist. Language change inevitably involves deviation from some norm, and these deviations are important, We shouldn't evaluate them though. We should just figure out how things work. Look, language is a complex phenomenon which includes how people feel about it. If you're really committed to pure description, you also need to include how people value language in your description. I know you're very committed to preserving your cultural identity with language, but we need to be scientific here. Wait a minute. First of all, cultural identity is a good thing to care about. All you care about is neutrality. How bloodless of you. Okay, calm down. Now you're getting irrational. Irrational? Well, it's better than being locked in an ivory tower. Okay. Maybe the conversation is going to go downhill from here on out. So, time out, I think. All right. Well, as the moon rises and the sun sets, I hope you have enjoyed this introduction to linguistics. It's meant merely as an appetite whetter for the material to come. And as always, the readings and the assignments will complement this video. So, thank you for watching.